Well, I'm very honoured and flattered and slightly nervous to be here because I'm usually talking about books, so I've had to think out of the box. But actually, I then entered another box with this question: does art work? And actually, are we talking about art, visual arts, or the arts? Having seen the Victor Hugo exhibition at the RA, a writer painting, you begin to think you can't separate the two. And then I remembered some time ago, I was asked by the Times to interview Iris Murdoch, writer, John Piper, painter, and Kenneth Macmillan, choreographer. And I was also asked to look at how they worked, which was really interesting, watching Kenneth Macmillan using bodies to make ballet. And I immediately realized that we all had ideas, writers like myself. I would like to say I was like Iris Murdoch, but anyway, writers, particularly of fiction, painters, and I do try and paint, but that's another subject, and choreographers. They all have the same approach, but they're using a different language. Words, paint, and bodies. So I found that terribly interesting. So I'm going to find it quite difficult to shut myself down into the visual arts, but I'll try. And I thought of it again because, just to give a bit of a plug, my wonderful cousin, James Reeve, who's a terrific painter and sadly died last year, and he has an exhibition on at the Mountain Without in Bristol. And the reason I can dare to mention him, because talking about art, the arts, is because he wrote a wonderful book called Travels with a Painter, absolutely brilliant. And there was no doubt that the same mind that was painting was writing. But I know that's a little bit of a diversion. What I'm going to talk about more is prisons. As it says there, I'm a trustee of the Longford Trust, which was founded when my father died in whenever it was. My brother, who's here, will tell me 2001. Anyway, hooray, got it right. So for a long time. And even longer, I've been writing and one of the editors for Inside Time, the prison newspapers. So I go into prisons all the time. I've been writing for it every single issue since 1990. And in that time, I've met all kinds of people, many of them people whose lives are completely disintegrated, totally disintegrated, and started badly, so some of them haven't even had anything to disintegrate. But I've noticed more and more that the arts, or in this case, the visual arts, will literally change them. And it's as if art provides a total space of peace and energy as well, that they can feel totally different from the, I don't know, I know some of you are involved with prisons, but there is no doubt that prison, even without problems inside, being locked in your cell all the time, not being enough of the various things there should be, work, education or anything else, even without all those problems, it is a very unnatural situation, and it's very difficult for people to concentrate and think. But I'm going to give a few examples here of people who, through art, have changed their lives. I brought with me, because I find it so extraordinary, this, which is not because of the religious significance, although it's very lovely. A cross has been used in many ways. But this was done by someone called Jamie Chapman, who was a South London boy of a family background which left him no hope to be anything but basically criminal. And from a childhood, he was in and out of prisons. Really for decades. And then he had a wonderful art teacher. And he suddenly found something that took him away from his past entirely. Education had not worked for him. That couldn't do it. I would argue that it could in his case not. And I think it's an example of someone so far away from what you would think was possible. And this is recycled aluminium with rusty nails in it. And he became an artist. He now lives in Weston-super-Mare, and he's also a tremendous philanthropist. And with his own hands, he's built a gallery. This is a sort of extreme of what can happen to people. And he has a little gallery which he doesn't charge for, but allows the university students to use for exhibitions and things like that. And Jamie, who I've met and talked to quite often, and he was actually a Longford Scholar. And this is something that we're very proud of course, when people go and get higher education. Longford Scholars basically are given monetary help to do higher education, and then they're mentored, which is just as important. And Jamie is a wonderful thing. He's now one of our ambassadors. But that's just a little, or not that little example. Then to give two more. One, and incidentally, one shouldn't forget, I'm sure you've all looked at what Earlstoke has produced. And I was in Earlstoke last week, or 10 days ago. And it's wonderful when you go into a prison and you realize that through prison visitors, in that case, or whatever it may be, they're getting something outside the bars. This is the thing, to give them a feeling there's something beyond where they are. And two Longford scholars who did this. One is called Lee Cutter. And Lee, unbelievably really, has been very, very successful. Started from a very, very low ebb. And he's just got, some of you may know about it, I may get the description wrong, but he's just won a place at the Givenchy, the Monet Garden. And he studies there, I think, for a year or something like that. And this is, I mean, he became an artist by cutting soap. I mean, that's an old art. I don't know whether you know about it, but in prison, if there's nothing to use, no paints, no anything in your cell, you probably do have a bar of soap. And his soap artists, actually, some of them were in the RA at one point. I mean, he's really extraordinary. He still does them, an amazing man, starting from base. And obviously, these are people who have ambition. I mean, another one I think of, where is he? Andrew Pierre Hart. He's just added the Pierre, which I thought showed a certain confidence. Andrew Hart wasn't enough. Anyway, he went on day release from the Chelsea School of Art and then to the Royal Society of Arts. And he's already had an exhibition at the Whitechapel Gallery. So this is a very unlikely source. And of course, here I'm talking about successful professionals. I think very interesting, and again, if none of you have ever been, I think it's fascinating, and it will be, I think it's moved till October, but the Koestler Arts Awards, which are for the arts, and it is principally the visual arts. And every year they have an exhibition at the South Bank, and they have 7,000 entrants. This is pretty astonishing, really. And these, mostly men, of course, in our prisons, there's 3,000 or 4,000 women, and the rest, the 88,000 or are men. So these are men, and it's mostly painting, but also embroidery, cushions, a lot of woodwork, of course, soap, as I've mentioned, sculpture, and they're not all brilliant, but an astonishing amount of them show really real talent. And I think one's got to be clear that the point is, and I'm looking at, obviously, from the perspective of the creator rather than the viewer. A whole other question would be, does art work, as it were, does it work for the viewer? This is, I'm talking about working for the people who make it. And I talked last year to one of the curators, John Costi, was again an ex-Longford scholar, and he raised that word therapy. And I get rather bored being told everything's therapy. You know, you pick up a weed and you're told that this is terribly good for you. But he did use it, and he has a right to do that. I like more in a way, there's a women's prison called Send, HMP Send. I love it because they have an exhibition themselves once a year for the women. And last year I talked to a woman called Maxine, and she isn't one of, there are a few who are really professional, and some who are making their living having left prison. They're mostly long-term prisons, so they have time to learn there. And Maxine said to me, when I paint, it takes me to a place of peace and freedom. So if you can imagine yourself peaceful and free while you're painting. And that gives a sense of possibility and reality and hope to what might happen when you get out. So it goes beyond therapy in my view, but so that, I think that is wonderful. And getting onto therapy, my daughter, one of my daughters, trained as an art therapist, and she made it clear to me how children, the reason art therapy exists, I'm sure a lot of you know this, children can actually paint things, even if they can't do it at all well, which they wouldn't be able to say in words. That it's a way of expressing how they're feeling and what, and their emotions, and their deep emotions. And that's for a child maybe, and you might say a child will find it hard. But I think it's exactly the same. I mean, artists here will tell me maybe something different, but that with art you can express something. And when I go into prison and talk to people, if I've seen a painting or they show me one, I will instantly know far more about that person, man, usually, occasionally women. And that leads me quickly, as I draw to a close. Oh, I'm all right still. To one of my oldest, dearest friends, another painter called Charlotte Johnson. And she had, I think, a wonderful, exciting painter. And her best paintings, I think, are later when she was living in New York, and they're absolutely fabulous. But in 1974, when she had 4 young children, and her husband, one of her children was our ex-Prime Minister Boris, and she adored her children. She was a very good mother, but she had a complete breakdown and was taken to the Maudsley prison, it's like I always get them muddled, the Maudsley Hospital, but she went voluntarily because she couldn't go on. And she had the horrors of people who see monstrous things, who see dirt, who see spiders, see horrors. And she was there for 8 months, and in those 8 months she painted 80 paintings. And this was completely extraordinary. And at the end of her time there, she had an exhibition in the mental hospital in 1974. And just at the end of last year, sadly not on, but I have brought a program if anyone's interested. Just at the end of the last year, the Museum of the Mind, which is a very interesting museum of art, which is attached to Bethlem Royal, which is the mental hospital, big mental hospital in London, and is linked to the Maudsley. And the paintings show what her mind, it's the same thing. You can see what's going on within her mind. And they are almost using it as a teaching tool because it's so clear. And she always said, and I think they actually printed it in the program, that I wouldn't exist if I couldn't paint. And I think someone who really, I know it's about writing. I can't not write. But I think for painting, perhaps it's even more extreme. Now, I don't say that every painter has to be locked up in a hospital or locked in a different way into a mental, into the prison of the mind. Though I think it is interesting, those are 2 prisons really. But I think art can break through that. And one of the things that I really sort of wanted to think about also, as I've said to you, about whether it is true, and maybe this will come up, whether art is a particular form, and whether that does something that no other art form can. And then I began to think about this, and again, with my work with Inside Time, one of the things I instituted, everybody was absolutely amazed. All men, women would have realized, sorry, that's very sexist, but that we should be publishing poetry in the prison newspaper, because again, poetry, it seems to me, has that particular ability to allow people, not necessarily in a way that is publishable, may not be a great poetry, in fact, very unlikely it will be, but it is a form which is, as I said, I think right at the beginning, is almost like a disguise. And I haven't yet published it, but this thing there, that's the cover of my book that comes out the next month, which is actually a memoir. And I never thought I would write non-fiction in that way, memoir. And then it made me think the difference between fiction and memoir. And people are putting on a disguise as well as showing innermost feelings. So it's a wonderfully complicated thing that you're both given the freedom to express yourself. The word freedom keeps coming in. I mean, I'm leaving aside all the difficulties of doing something good, and bearing in mind that a lot of these, I mean, like when I go into Send, you know, there'll be a charming bluebell wood, painted incredibly badly, but it will still be expressing something very important to that painter. So I mean, I do the difference between producing good art or great art. That's another thing altogether, but I think they hold together. And these poems that I publish, 2 pages every month, are fantastic, and a lot of them are very good. And another Longford scholar, Will Pendray, who's actually now writes for Inside Time. And incidentally, on the Longford lecture, we have quite a few of our Longford scholars are now trustees. So it's all about breaking through the misery of their going through. Anyway, the poetry is absolutely extraordinary as well. So I would put forward a little plea that it isn't only art that does work in the way I've suggested, but other creative arts can as well. And I'm so looking forward to hearing what everyone's going to say. So thank you very much. Thank you.